The ballroom smelled like white roses and polished marble. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Soft music floated through the high ceilings, the kind that made people whisper instead of speak.
I must say,
Guests in silk and velvet leaned toward one another, exchanging quiet speculation behind gloved hands, because today wasn't just any wedding. This was the Duke's wedding, and everyone had an opinion. If you enjoy stories filled with love, betrayal, and unexpected twists, make sure you stay with Duke's Courtyard, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. At the center of it all stood Elena Whitmore, still and silent, trying not to breathe too hard in a dress that felt heavier with every passing second. Her hands trembled slightly beneath delicate lace gloves, not from fear, or at least that's what she kept telling herself, but from anticipation, because after today everything would change. Elena. The voice came softly from behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. Isabella. Her older sister. You're shaking, Isabella said, stepping closer, her tone gentle but observant. Nervous? Elena forced a small smile. Wouldn't you be? Isabella let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. I suppose I would. There was something in her voice, something Elena couldn't quite place. For a moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence something felt wrong. You look beautiful, Isabella added. This time Elena turned, and for just a second, barely noticeable, she caught it. Not jealousy. Not sadness. Something colder. You always say that when you don't mean it, Elena replied softly. Isabella smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Across the room, the doors opened. The music shifted, and every conversation died instantly. He had arrived. Duke Alexander Ravensheir. Tall, composed, untouchable. The kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to command a room. Women admired him, men respected him, and no one truly understood him. Elena's breath caught. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would define the rest of her life. She had met Alexander only a handful of times. Their marriage wasn't born from love, it was strategic. Families aligned, reputation secured, a union that made sense on paper. But still, there had been moments, small ones, fleeting, where she thought maybe there could be something more. The music swelled, a signal. The ceremony was beginning. Guests rose to their feet, and the aisle stretched endlessly before her, lined with expectant faces watching, judging, waiting. Elena took her first step, then another, each one heavier than the last. At the altar stood Alexander, still, unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't move, didn't react, and yet his eyes were fixed on her, or so she thought. Halfway down the aisle, Elena felt it, that shift, that subtle change in the air, like something invisible had just broken. Alexander's gaze was no longer on her. It had moved. To the side. To Isabella. Elena slowed just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to feel it. The whispers began, soft at first, then spreading like fire catching dry wood. No, is he? That's her sister. Elena's heart pounded louder, faster, drowning everything else out. She reached the altar and stood before him, close enough to see every detail of his expression, and that's when she knew something was terribly wrong. Your Grace, the officiant began, voice steady but cautious, do you take Elena Whitmore? Wait. The word cut through the room like a blade. A collective gasp followed. Elena's world stopped. Alexander didn't look at her, not once. Instead, he turned, fully, deliberately, toward Isabella. You. The single word echoed, heavy, unmistakable. Every eye in the room shifted, every breath held. Isabella froze, for once truly caught off guard. What are you doing? She whispered. Alexander stepped forward, closing the distance. I made a mistake, he said, calm, certain, irreversible. The room erupted into whispers, shock, confusion, disbelief. Elena couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe, because deep down she already understood what was about to happen. I should have chosen you. Silence. Pure, crushing silence. If this moment shocked you, stay with this story, because what comes next is even more devastating. Isabella stared at him, searching his face, trying to understand if this was madness or truth. You're humiliating her, Isabella said quietly. Alexander didn't hesitate. Then I'll make it right. And then he did something no one in that room would ever forget. He turned his back on the bride and walked toward her sister. Elena's fingers tightened around her bouquet, petals crushed beneath trembling hands. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. But it was. And in that moment, everything she believed about love, loyalty, and fate collapsed. The wedding ended before it ever truly began. What would you do if you were Elena in that moment? Walk away or fight back? Because in the next part, everything changes. By the time the ballroom doors closed behind Elena, the silence inside her felt louder than anything that had just happened in that room. Not the whispers. Not the gasps. Not even the sound of her own name being spoken like a rumor. It was something deeper. Something colder. The kind of silence that settles in when a life you thought you understood suddenly doesn't exist anymore. She didn't cry. Not yet. And that was the part that scared her the most. Because when pain is loud, at least you know where it is. But when it goes quiet, it spreads. If you've ever experienced a moment where everything changed in seconds, you already understand what Elena was feeling right now. And if you haven't, stay with this story. Because what happened next wasn't something anyone in that room could have predicted. Outside, the night air hit her skin like a shock. The warmth of the ballroom disappeared instantly, replaced by a cold that felt almost intentional. Like the world itself was acknowledging what had just happened. Her steps slowed, not because she didn't know where to go, but because suddenly, there was nowhere she needed to be. No altar. No future waiting on the other side of a promise. Just space. And time. And questions. Behind her, the doors hadn't opened again. No one came after her. Not the man who was supposed to choose her. Not the sister who had just been chosen. That told her everything she needed to know. Or at least, everything she thought she needed to know. Because the truth is, moments like this don't just break relationships. They reveal them. Elena stopped walking when she reached the edge of the courtyard. The stone beneath her shoes felt uneven, unfamiliar, like she had stepped into a life that didn't belong to her. For a second, she almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because of how quickly everything had fallen apart. Hours ago, people were admiring her dress. Complimenting her composure. Telling her how lucky she was. And now, she was standing outside her own wedding like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong story. That's the thing about public heartbreak. It doesn't just hurt. It humiliates. And studies have actually shown that social rejection activates the same parts of the brain as physical pain. Meaning what Elena just went through. It wasn't just emotional. Her body was processing it like an injury. A real one. Which explains why her chest felt tight. Why her breathing wasn't steady. Why everything felt off. She bent down slightly, adjusting her grip on the bouquet, only now realizing she had been holding it too tightly. The petals had already started to bruise under the pressure of her fingers. She loosened her grip, watching as one of them fell to the ground. And for a moment, that single falling petal felt heavier than everything else that had happened. Because it was real. Tangible. Something she could see. Something she could understand. Unlike everything else. And then, footsteps. Not behind her. Not rushing. Just, approaching. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. Elena didn't turn immediately. Because part of her already knew who it wasn't. And somehow, that mattered more than who it could be. When she finally looked, it wasn't Alexander. It wasn't Isabella. It was someone else entirely. Someone who had been in that room the whole time, watching. Observing. Not reacting like the others. Not whispering. Just paying attention. He stopped a few steps away from her, not too close, not too far. Close enough to speak. Far enough to respect the moment. "You handled that better than most would," he said quietly. No pity in his voice. No forced sympathy. Just honesty. Elena blinked, slightly caught off guard. Not by the words themselves, but by the tone. Because it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like recognition. Like he wasn't trying to fix what had happened. Just acknowledging it. "I'm not sure how most would handle it," she replied after a second, her voice steadier than she expected. "That's because most people never have to find out," he said. There was a pause. Not awkward. Not heavy. Just real. And for the first time since everything fell apart, Elena felt something shift. Not relief. Not understanding. Just awareness. Because this moment, right here, wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, it did. If you're still watching at this point, comment strength below. Not for me. For yourself. Because walking away from something that was supposed to define your future, that takes more than emotion. That takes control. Elena looked down at the crushed petals in her hand, then back at the stranger in front of her. "Do you always watch disasters this closely?" she asked, a hint of something almost resembling humor slipping through. He didn't smile immediately. But when he did, it wasn't performative. "Only the ones that don't look like disasters when they begin," he said. And that answer stayed with her. Because for the first time that night, someone wasn't talking about what she lost. They were talking about what it actually was. And that difference? That's where everything starts to change. What Elena didn't know yet, what no one in that ballroom understood, was that this moment, the one that felt like an ending, was about to become something else entirely. Not redemption. Not revenge. Something far more dangerous. Clarity. The strange thing about clarity is that it doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't demand attention the way heartbreak does. It doesn't shake you or force you to react. It just settles. Quietly. Almost unnoticed at first. And yet, once it's there, everything starts to look different. That's what Elena was beginning to feel now, standing in that courtyard, looking at someone who wasn't trying to fix her, wasn't trying to explain what had happened, and most importantly, wasn't pretending it made sense. Because the truth is, not everything does. And for the first time that night, she wasn't searching for answers. She was just present. "You're not surprised," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, but steadier. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question more than answering it. "I'm not surprised that it happened," he replied. "I'm surprised it happened here." Elena let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a release. "In front of everyone," she added, almost to herself. "In front of the people who thought they knew the story," he corrected gently. That made her pause. Not because she disagreed, but because she hadn't thought of it that way before. And that's how perspective works. It doesn't change what happened. It changes what it means. There was a silence that followed, but it wasn't empty. It felt intentional. Like both of them understood that rushing the moment would ruin it. Elena shifted her weight slightly, the fabric of her dress brushing softly against the stone beneath her. Hours ago, this dress had meant something. It had been chosen carefully. Designed for a future that no longer existed. And yet here she was, still wearing it, still standing, still breathing. It's funny how quickly meaning can change. One moment, something represents everything you've been waiting for. The next, it becomes evidence of what never really was. If you've ever had to reevaluate something you once believed in, you know exactly how disorienting that feels. It's not just about losing something. It's about realizing you misunderstood it in the first place. The man took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to make the conversation feel more grounded. "Do you want the honest version?" he asked, "or the version people will tell you tomorrow?" Elena looked at him, really looked this time. There was something different about the way he spoke. Not rehearsed. Not careful. Just direct. "The honest one," she said without hesitation. He nodded slightly, as if he expected that answer. "Then what happened?" "And there wasn't a sudden decision," he said. "It was just the first time it became visible. That landed harder than anything else had. Not because it was cruel. But because it was precise. Because deep down, Elena knew, there had been signs. Small ones. Easy to ignore. Convenient to overlook. The kind that don't seem important until they all connect at once. She didn't respond immediately. Because responding would mean admitting something she hadn't fully faced yet. Instead, she looked away, her gaze drifting toward the closed doors behind her. That room, that moment, it wasn't just where things ended. It was where illusions stopped working. And there's something about that kind of realization that's both painful and freeing at the same time. "People will say he changed his mind," the man continued. "They'll say it was impulsive. Emotional. Complicated." Elena let out a quiet breath. "Wasn't it?" she asked. He shook his head, just slightly. "No," he said. "It was consistent." That word, consistent, stayed in the air longer than the rest. Because consistency isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, over time, until one day it's impossible to ignore. Elena closed her eyes for a second, not to escape the moment, but to absorb it. To let it settle fully. Because the more she thought about it, the more she realized, he was right. This didn't come out of nowhere. She just hadn't been looking at it clearly. And that realization, it didn't break her. It steadied her. Because there's a difference between being blindsided, and finally seeing something for what it is. When she opened her eyes again, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone else. But internally, everything felt more aligned. "And my sister?" she asked quietly. The man didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know, but because some truths aren't meant to be delivered quickly. "She didn't create this," he said finally. "She stepped into something that was already there." Elena nodded slowly. That hurt. But it also made sense. And for some reason, that combination was easier to carry than confusion. Because confusion keeps you stuck. But understanding, even painful understanding, lets you move. If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to do something simple. Comment clarity below. Because that moment when everything finally makes sense, even if it hurts, is the moment you stop being controlled by what happened, and start deciding what happens next. Elena looked down at her hands again, at the petals that were no longer falling, at the tension that had slowly started to leave her fingers. "So what now?" she asked, not out of desperation, but out of curiosity. And that difference mattered more than she realized. The man smiled slightly, not in a reassuring way, but in a knowing one. "Now," he said, "you get to see what was never actually yours, and decide what is." That wasn't the answer she expected. But it was the one she needed. Because for the first time that night, the focus wasn't on what she lost. It was on what she was about to gain. And that shift, that's where everything changes.
You know what's interesting about moments like this? It's rarely about what's happening on the outside. People will look at this and think it's just a difficult choice. Two people, one decision. But that's not what this is. This is what happens when someone has been choosing based on expectation for so long that when it's finally time to choose for themselves, they don't even recognize their own voice anymore. And that's the part nobody talks about, because from the outside, everything can look perfect, the right person, the right timing, the right life. But inside, something feels off, not loud enough to stop everything, but quiet enough to follow you into every decision you make. And the scary part is a lot of people don't stop. They go through with it. They convince themselves it's just nerves or fear or overthinking, and then one day they wake up in a life they never actually chose. So the real question here isn't who she should pick. The real question is, has she ever truly chosen freely? If you've ever been in a situation where everything made sense, but something still didn't feel right, then you understand this moment more than you think.
There's a quiet kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or prove anything to anyone. It just exists. And the moment you feel it, really feel it, you realize something uncomfortable but freeing at the same time. You were never as powerless as you thought. You were just focused on the wrong things. Elena didn't say anything for a while. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because for the first time that night, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence. And that was new. Hours ago, silence would have meant something was wrong. Now, it meant she was thinking. Choosing. Reclaiming something that had quietly slipped away long before she ever walked down that aisle. The man didn't interrupt her. He didn't rush her toward a conclusion. He just stood there, present but not intrusive, as if he understood that whatever happened next had to come from her. And that's the part most people miss. Healing doesn't happen because someone gives you the right words. It happens when you finally hear your own. You knew, Elena said eventually, her voice steady, not accusing, just certain. The man's expression didn't change much, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, like he'd been waiting for her to arrive at that point on her own. I knew enough, he replied. Not everything. Just enough to recognize what wasn't being said. Elena let that sit for a second. Because that's what this whole night had really been about, wasn't it? Not what was said, but what wasn't. The glances. The pauses. The subtle distance that never quite made sense until it suddenly did. And you didn't say anything, she added. Again, not angry. Just curious. The man exhaled quietly. It wasn't my place, he said. And even if it was, people don't listen until they're ready. That landed deeper than she expected. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about her too. About all the moments she chose comfort over clarity. About all the times something felt off, but she convinced herself it wasn't important. Because believing in something feels safer than questioning it. But safety and truth don't always go together. If you've ever ignored a feeling just because you didn't want it to be real, you already understand this part. Drop a comment that says, "Seen it before," if you know exactly what that feels like. Elena looked back toward the doors again, but this time, there was no pull. No lingering attachment. Just recognition. Like looking at a chapter that had already ended, even if she didn't realize it at the time. I keep thinking I should feel worse, she admitted. Like there's something I'm missing. Some reaction I haven't had yet. The man tilted his head slightly, considering her words carefully. Or maybe, he said, you're finally feeling what's actually there, instead of what you expected to feel. That stopped her. Because expectations, they have a way of shaping emotions before you even experience them. You think you know how something is supposed to feel, so when it doesn't match that script, you assume something's wrong. But what if nothing's wrong? What if it's just different? Elena let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing in a way they hadn't all day. So this is it, she asked quietly. This is what it feels like when something ends. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No, he said. This is what it feels like when you stop holding on to it. That difference, it changed everything. Because endings are loud. They come with emotion, reaction, sometimes chaos. But letting go, that's quieter. More deliberate. It doesn't always look like what people expect. And sometimes, it doesn't even look like pain. Elena turned that over in her mind, feeling the weight of it settle into something solid. Something stable. Because for the first time, this wasn't happening to her. She was part of it. She was choosing how to see it. How to carry it. How to move forward from it. And that's where control lives. Not in what happens, but in what you decide it means. I thought I was losing everything tonight, she said after a moment. The man's gaze stayed steady. And now, he asked. Elena looked down briefly, then back up, her expression clearer than it had been all night. Now I think I just stopped pretending, she said. There was no drama in her voice. No need to make it bigger than it was. Just truth. Simple. Direct. Real. And that's what made it powerful. Because truth doesn't need decoration. It stands on its own. If you're still watching this, take a second and hit that like button. Not for the story, but for yourself. Because recognizing the moment you stop pretending in your own life, that's not small. That's the beginning of everything changing. The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, like something had just been confirmed. That's usually where things actually start, he said. Elena almost smiled at that. Almost. But it wasn't quite there yet. And that was okay. Not everything has to resolve instantly. Some things just need space to become what they're meant to be. You're not from here, she said suddenly, shifting the conversation just slightly. Not to avoid anything, but because she was curious now. And curiosity meant she wasn't stuck anymore. The man's lips curved just enough to acknowledge the observation. No, he said. I'm not. Then why are you here, she asked. He didn't answer right away. And that pause, it felt intentional. Like whatever the answer was, it wasn't simple. Because sometimes, he said finally, you don't realize why you're somewhere until after something happens. Elena held his gaze, trying to read between the lines, but not forcing it. Because forcing answers had never really worked out for her before. And now, she asked. This time, the man didn't look away. Now I'm starting to, he said. There was something in the way he said it. Not dramatic. Not overly meaningful. Just, certain. And for some reason, that felt more significant than anything else he'd said all night. Because certainty, when it's quiet, tends to be real. The air between them shifted slightly, not tense, not heavy, just different. Like the beginning of something undefined. And that's where most people get uncomfortable. When things don't have a label yet. When you can't immediately categorize what's happening. But Elena didn't feel that discomfort. Not this time. Because for once, she wasn't trying to control the outcome. She was just, allowing the moment to exist. What happens next, she asked, but this time it wasn't about fear. It wasn't about needing reassurance. It was about possibility. And that's a very different kind of question. The man took a small step back, giving her space again, not closing the distance but not disappearing either. That, he said, depends on what you decide to do with what just happened. Elena nodded slowly. Because she understood now. This wasn't a moment that needed to be fixed. It was a moment that needed to be used. And that's where the real shift happens. Not when things fall apart, but when you realize you get to build something different from what's left. There's a moment after everything changes where the world doesn't rush to catch up. It just continues. The same air, the same space, the same quiet rhythm of things moving forward like nothing significant just happened. And yet, for you, everything feels different. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else would immediately notice. But internally, there's a shift. Subtle. Steady. Permanent. Elena stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not because she was unsure of what to do next, but because she was aware that whatever she did next would matter. Not to anyone else. Not to the people behind those doors. But to her. And that was new. For so long, her decisions had been shaped by expectation. By what made sense to others. By what looked right from the outside. But standing here now, in the quiet aftermath of something that could have broken her, she realized something uncomfortable and freeing at the same time. She didn't actually owe that version of herself anything anymore. The one who said yes. The one who believed everything was exactly as it seemed. That version of her had done the best she could with what she knew. But she wasn't that version anymore. And holding on to her would only keep her stuck. The man shifted slightly, just enough to signal he was still there, but not enough to interrupt her thoughts. "You're not going back in," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Elena didn't turn toward the doors this time. Not even out of habit. "No," she said simply. There was no hesitation in it. No second guessing. Just a quiet certainty that didn't need to be explained. And that kind of certainty, it's rare. It doesn't come from emotion. It comes from alignment. From finally seeing something clearly enough that there's nothing left to debate. The man nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something he already understood. "Good," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow just slightly, not defensive, just curious. "You sound like you had an opinion on that," she replied. The corner of his mouth moved just enough to suggest something between amusement and recognition. "I had an expectation," he corrected. "There's a difference." Elena let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Because he wasn't wrong. Expectations had shaped most of her life up until now. But this felt different. This wasn't about meeting expectations. It was about choosing something that actually made sense. "And if I had gone back in?" she asked. The man looked at her for a moment, not judging, just considering. "Then this conversation wouldn't matter," he said. That answer was simple. But it carried weight. Because it implied something bigger than just this moment. It implied that choices don't just change outcomes. They change which paths even exist. If you've ever made a decision that completely altered where your life could go next, you already understand this. Comment, different path, if you know exactly what that feels like. Elena shifted her stance slightly, her heels pressing softly against the stone beneath her. The night air felt different now. Lighter. Not because the situation had improved, but because she wasn't carrying it the same way anymore. And that difference, it changes everything. "So what does this path look like?" she asked, her voice calm, but something underneath it had changed. There was curiosity there now. Real curiosity. Not the kind that looks for reassurance, but the kind that looks for possibility. The man glanced past her briefly, toward the open space of the courtyard, then back at her. "It doesn't look like anything yet," he said. "That's the point." Elena frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought. "That sounds uncertain." He nodded. "It is. And that's supposed to be better?" she asked. "It's supposed to be honest," he replied. That answer landed in a way she didn't expect. Because uncertainty had always been something to avoid. Something to solve as quickly as possible. But now, standing here, with everything she thought was certain already gone, uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. And space can be uncomfortable. But it can also be where everything new begins. "You're very comfortable with not knowing," she said, studying him more closely now. The man tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm just not afraid of it." There it was again. That quiet kind of clarity that didn't try to impress, didn't try to convince, just existed. And for some reason, Elena found herself respecting that more than any confident answer she could have been given. Because confidence can be performed. But comfort with uncertainty? That's something else entirely. Most people are, she said. Afraid of it, I mean. Most people, he replied, haven't had a moment that forces them to face it. Elena let that sit for a second. Because that's exactly what tonight had been. Not just an ending. A confrontation. With reality. With truth. With the parts of herself she hadn't fully questioned before. And now that she had, there was no going back to the way things were. Not even if she wanted to. So this is it, she said quietly. I just start over. The man's expression softened just slightly. You don't start over, he said. You continue, just without the parts that were never real. That distinction mattered more than it seemed. Because starting over implies loss. It implies that everything before no longer counts. But continuing. That means you carry something forward. Something real. Something worth keeping. Elena nodded slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress again, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It just felt like fabric. And what if I don't know what that is yet? She asked. The man's answer came without hesitation. Then you give yourself time to find out. Simple. Direct. And yet, for someone who had always needed answers quickly, it felt almost unfamiliar. Time. Space. Not rushing into something just to replace what was lost. That required a different kind of strength. And maybe, that was what this moment was really about. Not just moving on, but moving differently. If you've ever realized that rushing into the next thing wasn't the answer, drop a "taking my time" in the comments. Because that's a lesson most people learn the hard way. Elena looked at him again, really looked this time. Not trying to figure him out, not trying to place him into a category, just observing. And what she saw wasn't someone trying to lead her somewhere. It was someone who wasn't standing in her way. And that difference mattered more than she expected. You still haven't answered my question, she said after a moment. Which one? He asked. Why you're here, she replied. This time, the pause was shorter. But it was still there. Intentional. Because I was meant to be, he said finally. Elena raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds convenient. It sounds simple, he corrected. There's a difference. She almost smiled again. Almost. Because as vague as that answer was, it didn't feel dishonest. And for now, that was enough. The night stretched on around them, quiet but not empty. And for the first time since everything changed, Elena didn't feel like she was standing in the aftermath of something. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something she didn't fully understand yet. And strangely, she was okay with that. Before we go any further, I want you to think about something for a second. Have you ever walked away from something you thought was your future, only to realize later that it was actually saving you? If you have, comment, I chose myself, because what happens next, that's exactly the kind of moment Elena is stepping into right now. The air felt different the moment she crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the shift from the open courtyard into the narrow stone passage, it was something deeper than that, something internal. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but intentional. Every step Elena took echoed softly against the walls, her heels no longer hesitant, no longer dragging behind uncertainty. There was a rhythm to them now. Controlled. Grounded. Decided. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something else was beginning to take shape. Not fear. Not regret. Something far more unfamiliar. Awareness. The kind that creeps in slowly once the noise is gone. Once the expectations are no longer loud enough to drown out your own thoughts. She didn't turn back. Not once. And that wasn't strength in the dramatic sense, it was something quieter. More real. It was the absence of doubt. But what she didn't expect was to hear footsteps behind her again. Not rushed. Not urgent. Just present. Consistent. Matching her pace without trying to catch up. Elena slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to confirm what she already knew. He hadn't stayed behind. The man stepped into the dim light beside her, not too close, not invading the space she had just claimed for herself. Just there. Walking. As if this had always been part of the path. "I thought you were staying back," she said, her voice calm but edged with curiosity rather than resistance. He glanced ahead, not at her immediately. "I said I wouldn't interfere," he replied. "I didn't say I wouldn't walk." There it was again. That way of speaking that didn't push, didn't pull, just existed. Elena let out a quiet breath through her nose, almost amused, almost thoughtful. "And you always follow people into unknown places?" she asked. This time, he did look at her. Not long. Just enough. Only the ones who don't belong where they were. That answer, it lingered. Not because it was mysterious, but because it felt accurate. Too accurate. Elena's steps slowed just slightly again, not out of hesitation, but because something about that sentence had reached deeper than she expected. "You seem very sure about that," she said. "I am," he replied simply. No explanation. No need to justify it. And for some reason, that made it harder to dismiss. Because people who guess, explain. People who know, don't need to. The passage opened slightly ahead, the walls widening just enough to let in a faint wash of moonlight from somewhere beyond. It revealed more than just the path. It revealed space. And space has a way of bringing thoughts forward that were easier to ignore in tighter places. Elena stopped this time. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand something before going any further. "You talk like you've seen this before," she said, turning slightly toward him. "Like you already know how this ends." He didn't answer immediately. And that pause. It mattered. Because up until now, his responses had been steady. Measured. Immediate. But this one required thought. "I don't know how it ends," he said finally. "But I've seen where it begins." Elena studied him more closely now, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "And where does it begin?" she asked. He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual this time. Not intense. Not overwhelming. Just intentional. Right after someone realizes they were about to build their life on something that wasn't real. The words didn't hit all at once. They settled. Slowly. Like something finding its place in a space that had just been cleared. And the truth is, this isn't just a story moment. This is something that happens in real life more often than people talk about. Relationships built on assumptions. On timing. On convenience. And then one moment, one decision, changes everything. If you've ever had a realization like that, comment, "I saw the truth," because that moment, it changes you. Elena exhaled softly, her gaze shifting away from him, not because she didn't want to look at him, but because she needed to process what he had just said without interruption. "You're speaking very confidently about something that just happened to me," she said quietly. "That's because it didn't just happen," he replied. Her head turned back toward him slowly. "What do you mean?" For the first time, there was a slight shift in his expression. Not dramatic. But noticeable. Something more serious. Something more grounded in reality than the calm detachment he had carried until now. "I mean," he said, "it's been happening for a while. You just didn't see it until today." And there it was. Not a twist built on shock, but on truth. The kind that feels obvious once someone says it out loud. Elena didn't respond immediately. Because she couldn't. Not because she disagreed, but because part of her knew he was right. There had been moments. Small ones. Easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. But they had been there. And now, standing here in a place that existed completely outside the life she had just walked away from, those moments were harder to dismiss. "You don't know me," she said finally, but there was no sharpness in it. Just a need to push back against how accurate he sounded. "No," he said. "But I recognize patterns." That answer didn't close the conversation. It opened it. Because patterns are something everyone relates to. And the uncomfortable truth is, most people don't realize they're in one until they step out of it. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Not in a bad way. In a real way. The kind that means something important just surfaced. Elena turned forward again, looking toward the opening ahead. "So what now?" she asked. Not looking at him this time. "Now," he said, "you decide what parts of your life were actually yours, and which ones you were just playing along with." That question didn't demand an answer right away. And maybe that was the point. Because some questions aren't meant to be answered quickly. They're meant to stay with you. To reshape the way you see things over time. Elena took another step forward. Then another. Slower than before. Not because she was unsure, but because she was thinking. Really thinking. And as she walked, something became clear in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't about what she had lost. It was about what she had almost built her entire life on, without questioning it. And that realization, it changes everything. If you've ever had a moment where you realized you were living on autopilot, comment, "I woke up," because that's exactly where Elena is right now. The passage ahead opened fully now, revealing something neither of them had mentioned yet. Not just another space, but a choice. A split. Two directions. And for the first time since she walked away from the altar, Elena hesitated. Not out of fear. But because this decision, this one wouldn't be made for her. She turned slightly toward him again. "Do you know which way I'm supposed to go?" she asked. He didn't even look at the paths. "That's not how this works," he said. Elena let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh of disbelief. "Of course it isn't," she said. Because for the first time, there was no script. No expectation. No clear next step. Just choice. Real choice. And that's where most people struggle the most. Not when they're told what to do, but when they finally have the freedom to decide. Elena looked at the two paths again. Then forward. Then, she made a decision. But you're going to have to wait for the next part to see which one she chooses. And trust me, that choice. It changes everything. If you're ready for part 7, make sure you subscribe and stay close, because this is where the story takes a turn you won't see coming. Before we finish this story, ask yourself one question: have you ever made a decision that looked right to everyone else but felt completely wrong inside? Not wrong in a loud, dramatic way, but wrong in the quiet moments, when you're alone with your thoughts and there's no one left to convince. If you've ever been there, stay with me. Because what Elena is about to realize isn't just a moment in her life, it's the kind of truth that changes how you see every decision you've ever made. Elena stood at the fork in the path, one step already taken but not fully committed, like her body had moved forward before her soul agreed to follow. The ground beneath her feet felt firm, steady, dependable, and yet something about it felt unfamiliar, like she had stepped into a version of her life she didn't quite recognize. The air around her was still, almost unnaturally quiet, as if even the wind had paused to watch what she would do next. It wasn't just silence, it was anticipation, the kind that presses gently against your chest and makes every breath feel intentional. Behind her, he hadn't moved, not even slightly. No footsteps, no shifting weight, no sign of impatience or expectation. Just presence. And somehow, that presence felt heavier than any words could have been. Because for the first time in her life, no one was guiding her, no one was influencing her, no one was silently deciding for her under the disguise of love or logic or expectation. For the first time, there was no invisible hand nudging her toward what made sense. And that terrified her more than anything else. She slowly lowered her gaze to her hand, the same hand that had trembled at the altar, the same hand that had felt the weight of a promise she wasn't ready to make, the same hand that had nearly sealed a future she hadn't fully chosen. She remembered the moment so clearly now, not the words, not the ceremony, but the feeling. That quiet hesitation she had buried under smiles and reassurance. That flicker of doubt she had convinced herself was just nerves. That voice inside her that had whispered something she didn't want to hear. And suddenly, it all came back. Not like a wave crashing over her, not like a dramatic realization that demanded attention, but like a truth that had been sitting quietly in the background, waiting patiently for her to finally stop running from it. She didn't love him. Not in the way people talk about love when they're being honest. Not in the way that feels undeniable and consuming and real. Not in the way she had seen in stolen glances between strangers or in the unspoken understanding between people who didn't need to explain themselves. What she felt had been different. Quieter. Safer. Easier to justify. She had chosen him because he made sense, because he fit into the life that had already been outlined for her, because he didn't disrupt anything or challenge anything or force her to question who she was. Loving him had been simple, not because it was deep, but because it didn't require her to change. It didn't require her to confront anything uncomfortable. It didn't require her to be brave. And for so long, she had mistaken that simplicity for stability. She had mistaken comfort for certainty. She had mistaken the absence of doubt for the presence of truth. And now, standing here with nothing but silence around her, she could finally see it for what it was. A choice made out of convenience. A decision shaped by expectation. A life built on what was acceptable instead of what was real. And for a brief moment, something sharp moved through her chest, something that felt dangerously close to regret. Because if she was honest, truly honest, it wasn't just about him. It was about her. About the way she had learned to ignore her own instincts. About the way she had learned to prioritize what made sense over what felt right. About the way she had slowly convinced herself that her voice didn't need to be the loudest one in the room. If you've ever stayed in something not because it felt right but because it felt easier, because leaving would have meant explaining yourself, because choosing differently would have meant disappointing people, because doing what you truly wanted would have meant stepping into uncertainty, then you already understand what she's feeling right now. You don't have to say much, just, I understand, because sometimes that's all it takes to know you're not alone in that experience. Elena exhaled slowly, a long, steady breath that felt like she was releasing something she had been holding onto for far too long. And then, without rushing, without forcing it, she turned. Not toward the man behind her, not toward the safety of being guided or reassured, but toward the path she hadn't taken yet. Because suddenly, everything had shifted. This was no longer about choosing between two men, two futures, two outcomes. It was about choosing between two versions of herself. The version who followed what was expected, who stayed within the lines, who made decisions that were easy to explain and easy to accept. And the version who listened to that quiet voice inside her, even when it didn't make sense, even when it led her into uncertainty, even when it meant standing alone in her choice. Behind her, he finally spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, not in a way that demanded her attention, but in a way that reached her anyway. Do you know why you stopped? His voice didn't carry pressure, it didn't try to influence her, it simply existed, like a question that had always been there. She didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because she did. I didn't come here to lead you, he continued, his tone steady, almost reflective. I came to see if you would finally choose on your own. Something about those words didn't feel new. It felt familiar, like something she had always known but had never allowed herself to acknowledge. That's when she turned back, fully this time, not out of confusion, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. And for the first time since he appeared, she really saw him. Not as an interruption, not as a complication, not as a second option waiting to be chosen. But as something else entirely. A mirror. He wasn't there to take her somewhere, he wasn't there to offer her a different path, he wasn't there to replace one life with another. He was there to reflect something back to her. To show her what it looked like to stand still and not be afraid of the choice in front of you. To show her what it meant to exist without needing to control the outcome. To show her that the answer had never been outside of her. And suddenly, everything made sense. He wasn't the alternative. He wasn't the better option. He wasn't the one she was supposed to choose. He was the interruption of a life she was about to settle for. A pause. A moment of clarity. A question she could no longer ignore. Nothing more, and yet everything she needed. And that's why he never followed her. That's why he never stepped ahead. That's why he never told her what to do. Because this was never his story. It was hers. Elena slowly turned her gaze back to the path she had almost chosen, the one that stretched out clearly, predictably, without surprises. The safe one. The certain one. The one that would have made everyone proud. The one that would have allowed her to move forward without having to explain herself, without having to justify her feelings, without having to face the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. And for the first time, she didn't feel pulled toward it. She didn't feel obligated to choose it. She didn't feel comforted by it. She felt free from it. Free from the need to be understood. Free from the pressure to make sense. Free from the idea that her life had to follow a path that someone else would approve of. So she stepped forward. Fully this time. Not cautiously. Not halfway. Not with hesitation disguised as logic. But with a quiet certainty that didn't need to be loud to be real. She chose the unknown. And when she crossed that invisible line, the one that separated who she had been from who she was becoming, something inside her shifted. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming way. Not in a way that demanded attention or validation. But in a way that felt permanent. Like a door had closed behind her, not trapping her, but protecting her from going back to a version of herself she had outgrown. She didn't look back again. Not because she was afraid to, but because she no longer needed to. And behind her, he didn't follow. Because he didn't need to. He had already done what he came to do. He smiled faintly, not out of satisfaction, not out of pride, but out of understanding. Then he turned, slowly, calmly, and walked back into the shadowed path, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, leaving no trace except the impact of his presence. Some people don't enter your life to stay. They don't come to be chosen, they don't come to be kept, they don't come to be part of your future. They come to wake you up. To interrupt the version of your life that you were about to accept without question. To remind you that you still have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it. And the hardest truth, the one most people spend their lives avoiding, is this: it's not about who you choose. It's about whether you were ever choosing freely at all. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a decision you've made, or one you're avoiding, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to Duke's Courtyard, because these stories aren't just stories, they're reflections of real choices, real moments, real truths that people don't always have the words to explain. And before you go, tell me in the comments, would you have chosen the safe path, the one that makes sense, the one that keeps everything stable, or the unknown one, the one that forces you to trust yourself without guarantees? Because the answer to that question might tell you more about your life than you're ready to admit.
Here's the truth most people don't like to admit. Not every person who walks into your life is meant to stay. Some of them aren't there to be chosen. They're there to interrupt something, to shake you just enough to make you question the path you were about to commit to. And if you're paying attention, Those moments can change everything. Because it's not about choosing the right person, it's about whether you were ever choosing from a place that was truly yours, not your family's expectations, not what looks good on paper, not what feels safe, but what actually feels real even if it doesn't make sense yet. And that's where most people hesitate, because choosing what's real often means walking into the unknown, and most people would rather stay in something predictable than risk something uncertain. But Elena didn't, and that's the difference. So now I want to ask you something. Be honest with yourself when you answer this. If you were standing in that moment with everything on the line, would you choose the path that makes sense or the one that feels right even if you don't know where it leads? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them. And if this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to Duke's Courtyard, because these aren't just stories. They're reflections of decisions people live with every day but rarely talk about, and the next one might feel even closer to home.